Hello, everyone. So, I remember when I did a video not too long ago about giving ex-felons the right to vote. Well, Floridians gave ex-felons the right to vote. However, lawmakers just put a big obstacle in their way. So, it's not as easy as people had thought, as we are not surprised. So, basically, they're telling you if you have money, you can vote. This is Patrick Penn, who spent 15 years in a state penitentiary, in a state prison, said that legislators' efforts to place restrictions on the voting rights of former felons. And so this is by Patricia Mazie, May 3rd, 2019, North Miami, Florida. In November, Florida voters approved a groundbreaking ballot measure that would restore voting rights for up to 1.5 million people with felony convictions. But the Republican led legislature voted on Friday to impose a series of sharp restrictions that could prevent tens of thousands of them from ever reaching the ballot box. So, in a move that critics say undermines the spirit of what voters intended, thousands of people with serious criminal histories will be required to fully pay back fines and fees to the courts before they can vote. The new limits would require potential new voters to settle what may be tens of thousands of dollars in financial obligations to the courts, effectively pricing some people out of the ballot box. Basically, they're telling you if you have money, you can vote, and if you don't have money, you can't vote. This is said by Patrick Penn, that was featured up top. He's 42 years of age. He spent 15 years in prison for a strong armed robbery and a violent burglary. So he has said that he does not know whether he owes any money to the court, but worries it could now prove a compilation when he gets ready to cast his ballot. But I believe it means complications. The way they wrote it is complicate. Yeah, complications. And so I'm saying it wrong. That's not the people. That's not the people. What people had originally intended on doing or voted for. So with the housing voting 67 to 42, along with party lines on a Friday to endorse the new restrictions. So the legislation goes next to Governor Ron DeSantis, who had called on the legislator to set additional standards for registering ex-felons to vote. So the vast majority of criminal defendants are poor when they are arrested and even poorer after they are released from prisons. So new restrictions have been attacked by civil rights groups and some of the initiatives backers as the exercise in Republican power politics driven by fears that people with felony convictions are most likely liberals who could reshape the electorate ahead of presidential election 2020 and beyond. So you know that's where this is probably coming from, more than likely. So Republicans have dominated Florida's state government for more than 2 decades, but elections are often decided by a fraction or a percentage point. And so it goes on to read that Republicans said that the restrictions are needed. And so this is redirecting me to something else. And the restrictions are needed. Okay, so to clarify how the ballot measure known as Amendment 4 should be put into practice. So they cited that the text of the amendment itself as requiring a rigorous interpretation of what constitutes a completed felony sentence and said politics was not their concern. So some have taken the position that this amendment will have some massive political impact, one way or another. So Representative James W. Grant, a Tampa Republican who sponsored the House legislation, said on Friday the outcomes will be what they may. And so Restoring voting rights to those who have had completed felony sentences has become a national issue, with most states over time loosening or lifting barriers that limited access to polls, such as and much so that at a recent town hall meeting, the Democratic candidates for the president were asked whether even prisoners, not just former ones, should be allowed to vote as well. And so voter registration, okay, so this is people who are in that category. So, but these are voters registered in Miami-Dade County Elections Office January 8th, the day Amendment 4 took effect in Florida. Okay, so but Florida had the highest number of people disenfranchised because of the criminal records. And when nearly 65% of Florida voters approved Amendment 4, the momentous momentous results was greeted as a historic civil rights victory in the state where African Americans were disproportionately disenfranchised. The measure left just two other states, Iowa and Kentucky, with laws that prohibit anyone with a felony record from voting. Pressed for time as they near the end of the annual session, senators on Thursday afternoon tacked the new repayment requirement onto previously unrelated bills that address some of the election problems that surfaced during last year's recount. So the surprise legislative maneuver forced Democrats who might have otherwise favored the elections bill to oppose it. So the state house had earlier endorsed a bill that included the strict repayment provisions. But as part of the compromise later Thursday between House and Senate Republicans, people with felony convictions who have ways to become eligible to vote other than just full repayment of fines and fees, they could ask a judge to waive financial obligations or convert them to community service. So the Senate had initially hoped to be more lenient, and it appeared that the compromise, in any case, would leave a large number of potential voters unable to register. So my heart is in a different place, and I would love to go farther, Senator Jeff Brandeis, a St. Petersburg Republican. He's a St. Petersburg Republican who sponsored the bill in the Senate, said before the vote on Thursday, invoking his Christian faith, it should be our place to always try to seek mercy over sacrifice. So we will continue to work towards that goal. So the final debate on the House floor on Friday lasted more than 2 hours, with Black Democrats emphasizing that felons had been barred from voting in the first place in Florida as part of a racist Jim Crow laws enacted during the Reconstruction period. So present in the House gallery was Desmond Meade, the president of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, who has won national acclaim for his work. So political scientists who study voter registration in Florida have said that re-engaging previously disenfranchised felons into the democratic process takes time and effort, and that any increase in the state's voter rolls would be gradual and would probably follow existing trends in which most new voters in the state register without party affiliation as well. And so Mr. Penn, an ex-prisoner, said that he registered to vote as a Democrat earlier this year, and when he got out in 2017, a return to normal life proved elusive. So employers hired him only to let him go sooner after learning more about his criminal history. So he could not afford to move out of his parents' house. So he had hoped at least for a chance to help choose the nation's leaders and have a say in how the city should be run or is run. So the voting thing is the most important to Mr. Penn, he said. So that's what creates the voice for people like ex-felons such as himself. So Dr. Mr. DeSantis said that while campaigning last year, that he'd hoped lawmakers would better define which felony convictions would prevent someone from voting, though he has not publicly weighed in on the compromise reached in the legislature. So Amendment 4 did not apply to people convicted of murder or sexual offenses. So lawmakers did that and then went further, also delving into the financial obligations attached to criminal cases. Without their guidance, legislatures said local court clerks and the state's corrections department and elections division would struggle to maintain uniform standards for restoring voting rights. And so this is Cory Booker here at Right, who is seeing Democratic nominations for the president, spoke to Richard Brown, a former felon in Miami Gardens, Florida, on Sunday. And so this is a big issue on whether they're going to spread this whole thing where more ex-felons can be allowed to vote. And so that may change the poll, what happens in Washington. So Republican lawmakers say that they want as many people as possible to be eligible to vote. And they noted that the proponents of the Amendment 4 said in court testimony and campaign websites ahead of the election that court fines and fees would be repaid. So they tried to walk this back, and Mr. Brandeis said in an interview, civil rights organization, however, countered legislatures went too far, okay, and that the more than 5 million Floridians who voted for the ballot measure did not intend for the court's debts to become an exception to the right to vote. So the text of the Amendment 4 said voting rights would be automatically restored for felons after they completed all terms of their sentence, including parole and probation. So that should be all that is needed, not additional fees, just a vote. So this is a great big slap in the face to the voters and a way to discourage people from participating in this process, which McCaw W. Kubik, an executive director of the Florida chapter in the American Civil Liberties Union. There's a stark disconnect between the joy and jubilation in November compared to folks now trying to do things in Tallahassee when no one is paying attention. So on the national stage, there's debating that should we allow people who are in prison to vote, but not us. We're kicking and screaming. Senator Perry E. Thurston Jr., a Fort Lauderdale Democrat, said in an impassioned floor speech on Thursday opposing the bill. So some former felons in Florida have already cast ballots in local elections. The legislation grants any of those people who might now be made ineligible to vote immunity from prosecution. So legislators long resisted calls to expand voting rights for Florida felons, choosing to act only after voters approved Amendment 4, which received more votes than any single candidate in November. So the new restrictions will almost certainly be met with legal challenges already being prepared by civil rights groups. Mr. DeSantis, a Republican who took office in January, has appointed 3 new justices to state's high court, shifting its balance towards conservatives. A federal lawsuit also appears likely. So restitution fines and fees are often turned into lien, which records a debt or records the debt but converts it to a criminal from a criminal to a civil matter. So the legislation adopted on Thursday specifies the conversion to a civil lien is not enough to make someone with a felony conviction eligible to vote. So the law would allow former felons to go before the judge, and no matter how long ago their case was closed, and ask for lien to be waived and converted to a community service, or the victim could forgive repayment of restitution. So the requirement to repay restitution in full would leave people like Coral Nichols, who was ordered to pay $190,000 when she was convicted of a grand theft and whose wrongful misuse of identity in 2005, unable to register to vote unless I won the lottery, she said. So Miss Nichols served 4 years and 7 months in state prison, followed by nearly 10 years of probation that ended just last week. So she has paid $100 towards the restitution every month. She said mailing checks to the post office box for the former employer she stole money from even after the company closed down. She said she still owes $180,000. I'm a contributing member to society, Ms. Nichols has said, 41 years of age, who founded a nonprofit in Seminole, Florida, to help other people after they are released from incarceration. I pay taxes, I work in the community, and I am redeemed, reformed, rehabilitated individual, but yet I'm not going to be allowed to vote because I don't have the money. So that is pretty much it in a nutshell. That is what this whole thing is about. And so, what are your thoughts and your feedback on this issue of letting ex-cons vote and be allowed to vote, and the restrictions that the Republican side of it is placing on it to put it in their way to prevent them from voting or to pretty much thwart the whole idea? With that being said, like, comment, subscribe, and thank you very much for listening.